Welcome back to this episode of Japan's Top Business Interviews. I'm your host, Dr. Greg Story, the president of Dale Carnegie Training Japan. It's my great pleasure to welcome back an old friend of mine, Michael Magee, who's the managing director for BRITA in Japan. Michael, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Greg.
So, Michael, how is it that you're in Japan and how is it that you're running a foreign corporation here? Give us some background on what you've been doing.
I'm actually a long-term resident of Japan. I say that because I was actually born and raised in Japan, mostly on the northern island of Hokkaido. So I've been here a good part of my life, actually.
And that was because?
My parents were working as missionaries, and so I happened to be born here.
And so presumably you went to college or school overseas, or?
Yeah, I went to college in the United States, and soon after I graduated, I came back not really knowing what I wanted to do for a career. To give you a sense of how practical I was at the time, I was a philosophy major. So I used my language skills. Growing up in a country is always the easiest way to learn a language. I used language skills for my first job. I actually started my career doing a startup with a Japanese partner, doing things like marketing services, creating brochures, promotional videos, things like that. But at some point, I wanted to go on to bigger and better things. So I went for formal business education in the U.S., came back, and since then I've been mostly in the marketing field, consumer marketing, companies like Johnson & Johnson, Philips, later to management roles in 3M and now with BRITA.
So that company, that startup, what year was that?
1987.
So the boom had just starting at 87. It was starting to rock and roll, right?
It was a very easy time to do business in Japan.
Yeah, and so what happened to that startup? Did it continue? Did you sell it?
I gave it to my partner who started it up together. So he managed it for several years. Since then, he actually closed down and also started doing something else. Mm-hmm. So that startup is no longer in operation.
Okay. So what made you get out of the startup and go and work for or do something else? What was it?
It was the attractiveness of doing bigger things, having a bigger impact on the world. I could see a ceiling to, let's say, the size of contracts that we were able to do, the size of projects. Also, I really wanted to have a formal business education. I found that I really enjoyed marketing, but was learning on the job as opposed to really having a formal education. So I went back for an MBA.
Okay, and where did you do your MBA?
University of Michigan in the U.S.
Okay, nice warm place in the winter.
Not quite.
Not quite. Here I am from sunny Queensland, so I probably don't want to go to Michigan in winter. So after the MBA, what happens? Where do you start working then?
I came back to Japan and worked for Johnson & Johnson. I had chosen consumer marketing as the area where I was most interested. So I started my career after business school as in product marketing.
And so at that time, and maybe in the startup too, I'm not sure, when was your first experience of starting to manage teams? When was it at Johnson & Johnson or in the startup you're actually managing teams?
In Johnson & Johnson, I started managing small teams, a lot of hands-on management, trying to, let's say, share knowledge that I had gleaned in the short time that I had working there. But really not with a formal management training. It was more of a learning as I went.
So, I mean, you've grown up in Japan. You've got the language, you've got the culture, you've got a very strong Japan background. I'm just wondering, though, were there any things when you actually became a leader? I mean, leading in any country has its challenges. You know, I'm leading in Australia. That's got certain challenges, even though I'm Australian. It doesn't equal you're going to be a genius leader just because you're from that country or you're in that culture. But in terms of when you first started leading Japanese staff, what were some of the things you found were either challenging or different?
I would first say that there are probably more similarities than differences. Cultural change is one thing. Cultural differences are one thing. At the same time, the difference between a startup and, let's say, a global corporation also has big differences. at the start of my career then, probably the change to corporate world was maybe bigger than the cultural differences. Having said that, some of the challenges, I think, let's say managing Japanese teams is that it's much more important to listen and to consciously take the time and have the patience to listen than it is to give directives. I think people here tend to think before they speak. They will speak less spontaneously, but have thought through something before they contribute, as opposed to being comfortable to speak and think at the same time and have, let's say, a collaborative discussion.
Which was exactly how you were trained in your MBA, I'm absolutely sure. Full of a class of very upwardly mobile, foreigners, where you really got to claim the airwaves and put your point forward and, be powerful in the group and all that sort of stuff. So how did you go about turning that off and switching it really 180 degrees?
Yeah. That's good that you mentioned that. That was exactly what I expected. My idea of leadership right out of business school was that I was the person giving directives and telling people what to do. And in fact, that's how I behaved early on. The thing that really changed it for me was taking a course, like a seminar on coaching as a management skill. It was a complete eye-opener that I don't need to give the answers. I should not give the answers, actually. I should help employees come up with their own answers.
And that was a coaching course here or in the States? Or?
That was here in Japan.
That was here, okay, great.
So it completely changed my perspective. It actually made me much more comfortable as a manager. Having a Japanese background, I also tend to be maybe a bit more reserved, less outspoken. So I was really making an effort to tell people what to do. This was a much more comfortable and natural way for me to be a leader.
What were some other things you noticed that maybe as the scale of your businesses got bigger or you had bigger teams, what sort of things came up in terms of different or challenging as a leader?
One thing I would say is, let's say, the hierarchy mentality. It's culturally very strong here, and it's also ingrained in the education system. So people come through a school system with a strong sense of superior, inferior, senpai-kohai relationship. That carries on very clearly into their professional life as well. So that the challenge, that creates actually a number of challenges. One is creating open communication. So if people are always held back by what I say is going to have an influence on my relationship with my superior or inferior, then that's very limiting as far as ability to be open and honest in discussions. The other challenge is that it's very inefficient. If somebody needs to talk to their manager, to talk to somebody else's manager, to talk to their colleague, this is obviously not a very efficient way to do business. So
in Japanese culture, if I went around my manager to a colleague in another section who had a different manager, that would be considered losing face for my manager? Is that what would be holding people back?
On both sides. Complaints from your own manager that you have not gone through the right channels. On the other side, it could happen as well. This is maybe a bit extreme and tends to happen more in, let's say, very traditional Japanese companies. But still, it is a factor for some people, especially coming out of those backgrounds.
And so continue with the things that were sort of different and challenging. As the scale grew and as your job title got bigger and the number of people you're leading got bigger, what are some things that came up?
It became harder and harder to get to the roots of real issues. So people are reluctant to express what they're really thinking. The idea of honne and tatemae.
Honne being the real truth and tatemae being the superficial truth.
Exactly. And it's much harder to get to the real truth in a bigger organization because of the layers, because of the complexity of relationships. So it's a challenge. It's still a challenge to really get to the core of issues in the business.
How many people working here in BRITA?
Here we have not such a big organization, a little over 30 people.
Okay, when you're at Johnson & Johnson, how many people are you looking after there?
They're actually even smaller teams.
Smaller teams, okay, right. So in terms of getting people to actually talk about the issues, what have you found works to actually bring those out? Because as you say, someone sitting on that table may have a solution to a problem, but they're not aware of the problem, or they're aware of the problem, but they're hesitant to speak up about the solution. And, you know, all you need is a solution to move on. So how do you get that sort of stuff to come up?
One thing I think is that it simply takes time to establish the trusting relationship with somebody, especially, let's say, as a non-Japanese foreign manager. It does take some time for people to really feel comfortable opening up and have a trust relationship. Relationships tend to be longer here, more difficult to start, but more enduring once they're established. Then, let's say, my reference is always the U.S., but I think relationships tend to be slower but deeper here. So it does take some time to establish that. But it was interesting that we did an engagement survey, and in addition to the engagement survey, on the first round, I also did one-on-one meetings with every employee to try and understand what's on their mind. This was soon after I joined BRITA. And everything was good. Everybody was happy working here, no major issues.
This is in the one-on-ones.
This is in the one-on-ones. Business was humming, everything seemed to be good. Then we did the engagement survey, and the scores came in surprisingly low, and especially on a number of topics. So this was quite a surprise. I thought everything was going fine. Business is good, people are happy, but it seems that's not the case.
And this is, in my experience, they're having these global surveys, and so, at some point all the country heads get together and you're in a room and they're showing global results, and here's APAC underachieving compared to everybody else, and at the absolute bottom of APAC scores is Japan. And so suddenly you get all this pressure from HR or from headquarters about, geez, Greg, you're not doing a very good job over there managing Japan. Look at these terrible scores. You've got to turn that around. Is that the sort of experience you had too?
Yeah, I did get some of that. I think the challenge there is getting headquarters to understand that, one, there is a bias here. I think Japanese staff tend to score things lower because culturally, people here tend to be critical, both of themselves and have high expectations on others as well.
Kampeki shugi, that sort of perfectionism. And so when they ask these sorts of questions, and the Japanese are looking into themselves, they go, well, I'm not perfect, so I'm going to give a 2 out of 5 score here.
Exactly.
Or maybe if I'm generous, a 3, I'll never give a 4, a 5, impossible score, So yes, you have that bias, don't you?
Bias. Yeah. So that takes some explaining, which is not always easy because it can easily sound like an excuse. The other challenge with headquarters, I tried to get around that by focusing on improvements rather than the absolute score. Sometimes that's successful, and sometimes we don't see eye to eye on that one. But as long as we're improving, I think we're probably doing the right things. But on the engagement survey, the first round came in quite low. We took actions as a management team. We tried to identify root causes and took actions, publicized the actions in quarterly town hall meetings. We did all the things that you would expect need to be done to improve those exact scores. But what happened when we did the second round was, lo and behold, there was not much improvement. In fact, some scores even went the other direction. And that
is management communicating clearly the directions? Quarterly town halls, down goes the score. You're like, what's going on here?
Yeah. And what we found is that then we did further digging qualitatively, and we realized that in fact we were not addressing the real honne issues that were underlying what was really bothering people. And so we had we'd taken a lot of action, put a lot of effort into the superficial topics without really addressing the underlying deeper issues in the organization.
Well, that comes back to your comment earlier about people not really telling a full story in meetings because they're worried about the hierarchy, they're worried about their relationships, and so they're all like ninja, they're hiding everything. And so did you sort of get a sense of that before the engagement surveys? Did you sort of, in the media, start to realise, hang on a minute, I'm not actually getting much out of these people about the issues? Or was it the engagement surveys came back and then you started to realise, oh, we've got a problem here?
Yeah. It was more that it came back from the engagement survey.
So up until that time, you thought everything's gone reasonably well.
Right. And we thought that we had gone deep enough to uncover the honne, but we had not gone deep enough, actually. So that's the challenge.
And I guess, the other part of it too is, I think, as you say, the glass is definitely half full, half empty, I should say, half empty for Japanese rather than half full. And so it is very hard to get them to be adventurous in their scoring. And you sort of put the scoring to one side and you say, okay, cultural bias, 1 to 5 scale, they're all going to go for 3 or less. But in fact, really uncovering the root causes, how long did that take to get to that stage?
After the second round, then we had a clear, let's say, scorecard to use to dig a bit deeper. And then also I had been with the company a bit longer, so when I did one-on-ones again, people were more willing to open up. We had a relationship by then. And then people started slowly to say, well, we have real manager behavior issues that is bothering us. And
were they referring to you in that regard or to your direct reports?
Mid-level managers.
But in that regard, it's very hard to get feedback in Japan when you're the boss. You can talk about, my door is always open, you can come and talk to me any time, and yeah, they're going to give me some feedback on how I'm doing. And of course, I notice with my Japanese, right, when I speak in Japanese, I know it's not perfect, and I always think, well, maybe people give me a hint if I'm making a mistake. Never happens.
Yeah.
No matter, keep making the same mistake over and over as a result. So how do you get that sort of feedback from people, for yourself particularly?
One thing that worked well was a very simple thing. We put a box in the office for anonymous people so that people could submit their opinions, requests, questions anonymously. And as soon as we did that, suddenly I started to get, let's say, a lot more, very specific feedback from people. So it seems that the anonymity was a key factor in getting people to open up. I think that goes back to people being very sensitive to relationships. They don't want to break their relationships by coming forward with their opinion, and they don't necessarily want to rock the boat too much. But they do have an opinion that they would like to express. So,
is it also a function of fear of retribution? Because Japan tends to be like that. If you're the whistleblower in this country, you get a hell of a time. Or if you put your hand up and start complaining about your manager's lousy management ability, your manager doesn't welcome the feedback openly and generously and say, "Oh, great, I'm glad you told me." So, how do you get around that fear of retribution?
I hope that's not the case in our company, but it could well be. It could well be one of the factors. I think one thing is to make it very clear that it's okay to make mistakes. The sense of perfection is quite deep rooted in the culture. If you look at, let's say, the history of art here, for example, the ideal was always to get as close to your master as possible. As opposed to the Western world, where creativity is the aspiration is to be creative. So it's very deep, and people don't like to make mistakes, or at least publicly make mistakes. So what I try to do is celebrate people who have taken a challenge, even if the result is not there. I will try to go overboard to congratulate people on the initiative, for taking the risk, for taking the challenge.
And how have you found that? Because often in Japan, not everybody, but a lot of Japanese get uncomfortable to be singled out for recognition, particularly for good work. Not necessarily, they tried a project, it didn't go well, and you support them, and all the faces are saved because you are supporting them, saying, even though it failed, you all did a really great job, we learned a lot from that, and everyone's faces protected, all good. But on the other side, where someone actually does really good work, and you recognize them. I've often found in Japan, a lot of Japanese don't feel great about that. They feel very nervous and uncomfortable that the knives are going to come out from their colleagues and get stabbed in the back. So how do you go about on the flip side of recognizing people?
Well, I think if you do it often enough, that will maybe take the edge off people of that concern. The other thing I've done is I find that sometimes managers think that they need to show me that they're doing their job as a manager by being strict to the employee and setting high standards for their reports.
Bishi suru type of idea, yeah.
So what I do then, I'll call manager and report together to a meeting on the topic will be project so and so, and they'll come into the office a little bit nervous. Are we in trouble? What happened? But I'll take over the meeting from there and start by going over the top, congratulating the report on what a job they've done. Thanks for the initiative. Very good work with your test market, whatever it may be. So that I hope that sets the tone for the manager as well. That their job is not to keep people in line; it's to motivate people, encourage people, bring out the best of their teams.
And do they get that lesson? Because in my experience too in Japan, most leaders are promoted on the basis of age and stage, how many years you've been with the company, how old you are. So you automatically go up the escalator. And they get very little, almost zero training on leading. They've only had the example of their bosses in the past, on-the-job training. And so are they actually realizing the modeling that you're doing is the exact model that you want them to be leading, or are they sort of absorbing all the praise themselves and then being very parsimonious about shipping it down the line?
Yeah, I have the sense that it is changing slowly. There's a big difference between, let's say, employees here who have been working for multinationals versus people who have come from a background working in Japanese corporations.
What's the difference?
Well, people who have been in multinationals are much more used to, let's say, leadership training, not only leadership, but taking part in seminars, training sponsored by their company to improve specific areas of their performance. Japanese companies less so, where it's more on-the-job kind of training. So I think people who have been in multinationals are maybe more comfortable taking on new learnings and running with it. It's a bit too early to tell, but I'd like to think we're making progress in doing, let's say, a cultural change in the company.
And what are the things you've done? You get the engagement results, yes, that's one indicator. But just generally speaking, how do you go about getting the team engaged as their leader? I read a quote by the Aussie rugby union coach, Eddie Jones, who's coaching England. And he said, his job was to motivate a very diverse and complex group of individuals. And I was reading this about coaching rugby, and I thought to myself, gee, that's what I'm doing. And I look at my team, they're all quite diverse, and everyone's complex as an individual. And our job, and his job as a coach in the game of rugby, and our job in the game of leadership is to coach rather a different group. So how do you go about getting people engaged?
One thing is to, I think, have a common sense of purpose. There will always be conflict, and people will have different interests and personalities and so forth. But having a sense of purpose, beyond just, let's say, the sales numbers, beyond, let's say, a functional output, it really helps to bring people together.
This is the why.
The why.
The famous why, right?
Exactly.
So how do you communicate that why to people?
In our case, it's, I would say, maybe relatively easy. We have products that are very much related to sustainability. Let's say we have an alternative to single-use PET bottles. And so there's a sense of purpose around working for the environment, driving our business, which is going to support the environment.
If you want to be successful as a leader, do the Leadership Training for Managers course. All companies need people who can both manage and lead. Leading people screams out for real skills in communication, dealing with all different types of people, being excellent at innovation,
planning, delegation, handling mistakes, doing performance reviews really well, and inspiring and motivating the team. Do the Leadership Training for Managers course now in either Japanese or English.
I guess people must be feeling really vindicated now, because in the last year, year and a half, 2 years, this whole issue about plastic in the oceans, which really didn't ever come up, but it's really come up now. And there you see, no more plastic straws, people looking for reusable containers. You were probably a leader in that field, way ahead of the game before the rest of society caught up with this idea. So did you find in the last couple of years the sort of pride in the team has really gone up?
Yeah, it's visibly gone up. And the sense of purpose is much more tangible now as well. So we have an answer that consumers can use today. And so it's not that we do sustainability initiatives as another activity to help our brand. It's that our business itself is a very sustainable brand. So it's easy to rally the organization around this vision and sense of purpose. I think that goes a long way to bringing engagement up. The other thing is to get over the hierarchical barriers and get people to relate to each other as people. I think organizational issues, personality conflicts can really get in the way of engagement. One step we've taken is to set up a social committee, and we try to have fun together, which is another way to get engagement.
Is this a new thing in the company?
This is a new initiative.
How long ago we started this?
Almost 1 year now. And,
well, tell me this, I'm quite an introvert personally, and I'm also very self-sustaining, very independent. So I don't need that stuff myself. But as the boss, that might be very well for me, but there are other people in my team who need that sort of social glue and need those get-togethers more than I certainly do. And I've always found it's not my natural play, and so I'm sort of like a workaholic. I'm just focused on the work, and I'm oblivious to that need. And I always find I'm the sort of blockage to doing that sort of stuff. So I have to sort of engage other people to be the party person to organise all this stuff, because if it ever depended on me, it'd never happen, So how about you? Are you a party person whose natural play is that, or?
I'm exactly the same way.
Yes.
So
I'm feeling better now. It's not just me. Okay, good.
No, it's completely delegated to people who are better at this than I am. But it's gone a long ways to getting people to, let's say, relate to each other as people, respect each other as people before the marketing person or the salesperson or the F&O person. So I think that's been really good.
Yeah, that delegation of that particular task helps a lot, doesn't it? And so if we think about in the company, you've got obviously product is being developed in labs, and that's a very technical process. But if we thought about innovation, I don't mean technical innovation, because you probably, unless you've got an R&D lab here, that's unlikely to be happening. But in terms of the marketing innovation or the running of the company innovation and way of doing things better, cheaper, faster, that type of thing. How do you encourage innovation in your teams?
One is, as I mentioned, we try to celebrate those successes. We give awards to, let's say, people every year now. This is also a new process where somebody gets the Innovation Award, somebody gets the Entrepreneurship Award, somebody gets the President Award. So
how many years has this been going on?
We've actually just done our first one.
Oh,
so
okay.
This is also a new process. So we're really trying to find ways to encourage the behavior. I think this also cascades a bit in the organization. If I reward directors, I think they will learn to do the same to their managers, who will do the same for their team. So,
and are they?
Yes, I see it starting to happen.
Well, because that's a big achievement. Because again, in Japanese corporations, or actually not just Japanese corporations, any sort of corporation, the middle management tend to be sponge-like in absorbing information from above about what's going on and new directions and initiatives and blah blah blah, and they're terrific at absorbing that, but they're not so great at passing it down the line. So often the why gets from the corporate suite down to the middle management and hits concrete underneath the sponge, and the people at the bottom never find out the why. They just get the what. what you need to do, and not necessarily the how, but the what and possibly the how, and very rarely the why. So how have you found getting your middle management to actually not be just a sponge, but also a sponge that can pass it down the line, not be a concrete blocker?
Actually, I would say that we expect that less of managers now than we used to. Our expectation,
The blocking, you mean?
or the let's say cascading
Cascading,
information.
okay, right.
So we're going more to a model where we try to share information to everybody at the same time. Of course, we're a relatively small organization, which allows us to do that as well. More importantly, we're trying to get management to bring information up the other direction as well. I was actually very proud of the team recently, where we got a proposal as a management team. Can we start a policy where there's no more, let's say, PET bottle usage in the office? Marketing team and sales team have agreed that this would be a good idea. Can we make it a policy? So that was a good example of something came from the
So
bottom.
eat your own dog food type of mentality, right?
That's right.
We should get rid of these damn plastic bottles ourselves and only use our reusables. Yeah.
But much better than if we had done a management directive. We must do this now. It came the other direction, which is perfect.
And how did you recognise that initiative? What did you do about it to give people the idea that, hey, this is really good work and we should all do more of this type of thing?
Well, then we recognized the initiative in a town hall meeting and gave our full support to do that. So to this day, it's not in writing that this is a policy, but it's the unspoken rule in the office.
It's a bit like the Japanese idea of loyalty. The Toyota car park would
correct.
never have a Mazda car in the car park, right? Or a Mitsubishi. It would just never happen, or a Nissan. And so, unlike the West, I mean, I used to work for Ford on the assembly line in Brisbane, and there was a big range of vehicles in that car park. But anyway, in terms of gaining trust, because anytime you want to introduce change or motivate people to move along, you've got to get them engaged for a start, because if they're not engaged, if they don't care, they don't care. If it's better or worse, they just don't care. So I'm here to pick up my pay and go home, keep a low profile, keep out of trouble, I'll be good. And so first level, get them engaged. And then from that engagement, you'll get initiatives like, hey, listen, why don't we dispose of PET bottles ourselves and only use reusables as a, modelling for everyone else. That's great. And the other part of that is getting trust. How do you as a leader get trust from the team?
I think listening is really the key. If people feel that they've really sincerely been listened to, I think that's the start and really the key to an open relationship. So maybe one thing for people coming to Japan for the first time, I can say is that it's important to really make an effort to listen and be comfortable with silence. I've seen many cases where, let's say, somebody coming from outside of Japan is in a discussion and they're not comfortable with the silence, so they need to fill it, and then it's a one-sided conversation.
That's every Australian businessman I've ever had to deal with in this country when I was doing trade promotion, exactly like that.
But this can really get in the way of a trust relationship. And people here tend not to complain either, so the conversation will appear to go nicely, but inside people can be a bit resentful that it was a one-sided conversation. And
in your own case, you mentioned about when you came back with the MBA, you started being very command-oriented. How long did it take you to realise, actually, I need to be a better listener and stop being so command-oriented? How long before the penny dropped?
One of the things one way that I learned was I had a manager who was also quite command-related, and this is the first time I'd experienced this.
You're your own manager?
Yes, exactly.
You're a direct report above, yeah, okay.
So I recognized this as part of corporate life that wasn't working very well for myself. So I reflected on my own behavior and that something's not working in this relationship. So I think that reflection was probably the first that I really consciously started to think about that.
So if you're a new person, managing a team, and you coming out of that foreign environment where it's kill or be killed, crawl over the bodies to get to the greasy, pole, top of the pole, and thrusting ever forward, dominant, powerful, aggressive. That's the typical Western format for business, right? So when they come here and they've got to switch gears and actually listen, what's some things that you'd recommend to help them make that switch? Because it's not a natural switch. When you've been sort of trained one way, and as you say, they're uncomfortable with the silence, so they want to jump in and fill up all the space. How can they actually learn how to shut up and listen?
Good question. Maybe I could suggest spending time outside of the office with their team members. I think people here also tend to behave differently in different roles. So in the office, people can be quite stiff and feel that it's not okay to be, let's say, informal and have a normal conversation. People outside of the office tend to behave quite differently. So. And
do you do that? Do you go out, the classic, go to the izakaya and having beers and, squid or something, or no?
Not so much. It's like social committee events is one way that we do that. Other than that, we've rearranged the office so that there's places where people can go and take a break and have conversations. So even in the office, we try to change the atmosphere a bit from, let's say, a stiff, joyless place to something where you can communicate with people.
And this is an open plan office?
Yeah, it's a free address. Free
address, and so you're not having a lot of executive offices around the windows like you typically have.
No. Except for myself, it's all free address. I volunteered for free address myself, but they told me there's too many private conversations that I need to have.
They want to stick you in a glass box and keep you away from them. Is that the idea?
Are you doing business with Japan? Do you really know how things work? Japan Business Mastery provides the answers. Do you have the right networks and know how to create them? Do you know how to get on the same wavelength with Japanese buyers? Do you know what being trustworthy looks like from the Japanese perspective? Japan Business Mastery is based on more than 30 years experience in Japan and will become your go-to guide. Want to succeed in Japan? Buy Japan Business Mastery now.
So, okay. So in other terms of gaining trust, apart from listening, what other things have you found that were useful to do?
Maybe one advice I could give, language tends to be a big barrier here because it's so different. To, let's say, have somebody who can help manage the lost in translation element. For myself, growing up here, I have a command of both languages. Sometimes it's very painful to watch how much is lost in the communication because of language. So if you can find an ally that can really understand the nuances, that can help clarify what's the intention, help, let's say, fix the miscommunications as they happen, that can really go a long ways to also building the relationships.
Usually for expats, a 3 to 5 year posting. I mean, these days, once you crack 5 years, they start taxing your entire global income, right? No one wants that. Well, except for people like you and me who are signed on. We aren't going anywhere. So they tend to have rather short time frames. So learning Japanese, they probably come. They think, well, I'm only going to be here for 3 to 5 years max. It's not worth it. And then this language, it's so difficult, So how do you encourage them to think a little bit differently about that idea?
I think the communication will tend to have to happen in English, and so it's less a matter of, let's say, expats learning Japanese as much as having somebody who can clarify when the Japanese partner is not fully proficient in English or not able to communicate the nuances. So having somebody who's very bilingual to help out in those situations, I think is a big asset.
And what about the classic, your executive assistant who speaks excellent English suddenly becomes the interpreter for all the meetings and you become very dependent on that person? I've seen that happen a number of times, but not necessarily as a good result. So what are your views on that?
It all depends on the individual. If that doesn't work, then I think it's worth investing in, let's say, a contract interpreter who can help out when needed.
The thing I was thinking about there was it's very rare that, and they're usually women, who have those positions are usually not educated in business. They're educated in language, and they have a very strong language interest. And they studied overseas. They want to use their English capacity back here. And so often the expats are asking too much of them. They don't have, business experience. They don't have product experience or service experience in reality. They don't have depth. And yet they become the sort of centerpiece and also can become a type of control agent for the boss too, who gets to talk to the boss and who doesn't, and what information the boss hears and doesn't hear. Any gory experiences that you've seen on that front?
I've seen that, but that's not even actually the worst situation.
Okay.
Even that's preferable to, let's say, somebody more senior in the organization that has their own agenda. The interpreter has a lot of control. They can guide the discussion. They can change the tonality. And so, let's say, having an objective, let's say, third party that can really do a good job, I think is the only answer to really manage that. If you're lucky, you have an assistant that's also very good.
But what about that case where you said where like someone has their own agenda? What's an example you've seen of that?
Something as simple as contracting with a new partner. If your in-house interpreter, if your staff that's doing the interpreting really wants the deal to happen, they can go a long ways to making the discussion go that way. If they don't want it to happen, they can also help steer the discussion in that direction. So it can really influence the outcome of important decisions.
And I guess too, because we talked already, Japanese are not necessarily so forthcoming unless the relationship is there and the trust is quite deep. So trying to fathom what the hell's going on here is not that easy. You don't speak the language, you don't know the cultural nuances, you're getting fed into English, probably what some people have decided you need to hear. And also there may be, hidden agendas going on around power and, within the company. How do you navigate your way through that in a 3 to 5 year posting?
Maybe one hint could be to network with other expats going through the same thing as well. I think a lot of the experiences tend to be very similar. So hearing from others' experience can help you find the pitfalls. But also, I think it's important to sort of set your own expectations as well. You will probably fail a couple of times. You will probably run into situations that you didn't expect. But I think in general, people here tend to be very civic-minded. They tend to be wanting to do the right thing. Compliance typically is not as big an issue as it is in other places. So the risks, I would say, are also not as high as maybe other parts of the world.
It's actually the opposite problem, isn't it? Because in many industries in the West, we will factor in, particularly in product, we'll factor in a 3% defect rate. Because the amount of money, additional money needed to get to 100% no defect quality is considered uneconomical or not worth it. And we'll rather have a 3% defect rate and make a lot of money. Whereas in Japan, it's 0 defect rate. And if you've got a scratch on the box, they're complaining, type of thing. So that's a really different way of looking at quality, isn't it? So how do you get around that sort of issue?
I think it's important just to be respectful. The challenge is when an expat comes, they come with the mission to drive some kind of change. So they come with an agenda, communicated by headquarters, or maybe they have an agenda of their own. So the expectation is that they're coming to drive their agenda. I think if they come with the attitude of respect, that they're dealing with a team that's probably very capable, has a lot of capabilities, has very high standards, that attitude will go a much longer way than trying to really change what's already working. So maybe coming with a bit of humility, a bit of willingness to learn and respect, as opposed to expecting that they will come and change everything.
How long do you think people should give that process? Because often, as you say, they're sent out to Japan because, and this is often a very typical case, the previous president was some very ancient Japanese ex-president of another company who's been hired in to run the business, and year after year after year, the results are either flat or declining. And at some point, the logic that we need a Japanese in Japan to run the business starts to fade out. And they start to think, well, actually, we're not getting anywhere over there. Maybe there's something differently. They send in the expat then with instructions like, turn that business around. We've got to get this baby running, hurry up. And so their expectation timeframes are often very, very quick compared to getting any type of change in Japan, or even decision making in Japan, and from the client's point of view.
Yeah.
How do you navigate your way through that little minefield?
Yeah, I think results will come fairly quickly if let's say the expats coming in can get rid of the ambiguity. I think that culturally ambiguity is much more tolerated here, and people are comfortable keeping things ambiguous over time, which is typically not the case, I think, in the Western world anyways. So I think
What would be an example? We talk about ambiguity. I mean, people who are listening to this might be thinking, what does he mean, ambiguous? What would be an example of that ambiguity?
So something as simple as, let's say, roles and responsibilities. So who's accountable for which result is something that could go undefined in the organization here for some time, and could be a direct influence on negative results. Creating clarity on those things, which people here may be a bit reluctant to do, I think would go a long ways to generating results.
So you've got that groupism where we're all responsible, so none of us are personally responsible, sort of cop out, right, when things go wrong.
Yeah.
Which actually, when you think about it, is a genius idea in corporates, isn't it? Because in Western culture, you get it in the neck and have to, be accountable if things go wrong. But in Japan, very few people get fired when you have major stuff-ups, and I mean big stuff-ups, and no one gets it in the neck, and somehow we're all responsible. We're going to take a 1 month pay cut, and we keep moving on. So it's quite a different approach, isn't it?
To add to that, avoidance of conflict is another phenomenon here as well. When conflict needs to happen, it's maybe easier for somebody from the outside to come and make the conflict happen. That's maybe another way to turn things around.
So you can actually use your foreignness, your gaijin aspect to your advantage, and maybe push things a little bit harder than maybe a Japanese person could, because of all their existing relationships.
Exactly, and you're outside of the expectation to live by social norms, so it makes it easier. Actually.
Yeah. The expectation of foreigners is pretty close to zero, so you're not struggling to meet their expectations too much. So if we think about someone who has been given a posting, we're going to send you to Japan, we're going to have a 3 to 5 year posting, go over there and fix the business, or they've arrived, they're already here, and we're going to think in a minute about what would be some advice we'd give them. But just before that, are there any areas in the discussion about leading in Japan which I haven't asked you about, or which you think are sort of important topics which we could have touched on but haven't so far?
Maybe, maybe, for example, you could have asked about competitive dynamics.
Let's talk about that.
Yeah, I think maybe this is different industry to industry. For where I'm working in let's say, consumer marketing, the dynamics tend to be quite different. I find that especially local competition tends to be less strategic, but much more tactical, much harder working. And so it changes the game a little bit in terms of expectation on what will happen when we do this or that.
So what are they doing? They're throwing more resources at it than you are. They've, like Japanese will always amazes me. Like, for to give an example, like karate tournaments. I competed in karate from 17 to 35, so I've been in, and then I was a referee and a coach, so I've been in truckloads of tournaments. And in Australia, it's always the absolute lean and mean, way of running a tournament. But in Japan, always struck by how many bodies there were. There were so many people around to do stuff. I was like, wow, amazingly different. And that's that idea of, if there's a problem, throw bodies at it, or if there's a need on the client part, throw the bodies at it, where we're sort of coming from the lean and mean school.
How do we efficiently do
Yeah,
things?
so how do you compete with that?
I think we will never compete well playing the same game. So, for example, competitors will tend to put a lot of people exactly in the field to influence point of sale, for example, whereas we will spend more money on communication, things like that. I think playing our own game is the best way to compete, but recognizing that there's things happening out there. Also, Japanese competitors tend to be consistent. They follow the same strategy and wait till somebody makes a mistake as well. A much more conservative approach to competition.
So your ability to sort of strategize the competition strategy is pretty high, because they're quite predictable, and you could they don't flip too much, or they don't pivot too much. It's sort of like you can expect this is going to just keep going like it is. Does that help?
Maybe in some ways, it's still not an easy competition, because there's a lot of effort, and people work very hard here. So competition is not easy.
So in terms of that strategic dynamic, what are some things we can do you think, to counterbalance that?
So I think one is to set real expectations, that, for example, airing a flight of TV advertising in itself is not going to change the game, that it needs to happen in conjunction with many other things to really move the needle in the market. Things tend to change slowly here, so doing things, again, consistently over time, I think is important. And the competition is willing to wait, so it needs to be done consistently.
Sorry, you said the competition's willing to wait. What does that mean?
So they'll wait till, for example, many multinationals struggle here because they'll have a management change, come up with a new strategy, another management team comes in, a new strategy, and so things are done inconsistently. In the meantime, the competition is executing in store and winning the little battles over time, and that's a tough competition to win.
Actually, I won't say the name of the company, but as a training company, we deal with many different industries. There's a particular company I'm thinking about. Honestly, it's just constant turmoil, because their strategy is constantly changing. It just never settles. And I often think to myself, how do you get any business done with no consistency here and no solidity, particularly when you're dealing with clients who expect those things? So yeah, it's fascinating to watch that. And you see, it's like, wow, I don't know how you guys make any money here, but I guess they do. So what would be some other things you think we could have talked about that we haven't talked about so far?
Yeah. Maybe you could have asked what's rewarding about working in Japan.
Okay.
I think the joy of working in Japan is really the relationships. As I mentioned earlier, relationships here tend to run deep. If you have a friend, you can have friends for life. That's really been a rewarding aspect of working in Japan for myself. I think something to look forward for people coming here.
Yeah, anything else?
That's what comes to mind.
Pretty good. So let's think about 3 pieces of advice in addition to what you've already told me. So someone is going to get on a plane, as I said before, they're going to be sent here for 3 to 5 years, and you're going to give them 3 pieces of advice on leading in Japan. What would those 3 pieces of advice entail?
I would say, this is maybe a bit of repeat, I would say practice listening and prepare yourself to be a very good listener. I would say be willing to learn, let's say respect what's already, the capabilities that are already here. The other would be to really get to know people as individuals, find a way to break through quickly to really relate to people on a deeper level than, let's say, a professional level.
Any hints on how to do that?
Again, spending time outside of the office, being open and honest yourself. People recognize that, I think, very quickly. If I can add one more thing.
Yeah, please.
I think the fairness is very important here. It's a collective society, and people have a very fine sense of fairness. And if the equilibrium is off on fairness, then people can be dissatisfied very quickly. So having a sense of fairness, how are people going to react to different actions that you take? Is that fair for everybody? Maybe requires extra sensitivity here.
It's sort of interesting because for a lot of outside views of Japan, Japanese people seem to be wooden-faced, not showing any emotions. They seem to be very formal, and so you never actually feel that Japanese are very emotional. You think, oh no, they're not very emotional. But as you live and work here, you realise how emotional actually they are. And that's always, I think, a bit surprising for people. They start to realise, wow, they are very emotional. They make decisions based on those emotions. It's quite interesting. I guess you've seen that on numerous occasions.
Yeah, I think the language speaks for itself. It's a language full of, let's say, color and rich emotion. So it's definitely a factor here.
It's been great chatting with you about
Thank you, Greg.
leading in Japan, Michael.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Well, what a great talk we've had with Michael today. Michael Magee from the BRITA Japan organisation here, and saving the world through cutting down on plastic PET bottle usage by having the reusable product. So we all got to get behind the product. And we thank him for sharing his views on leading in Japan. And please join us for the next episode of Japan's Top Business Interviews.